What's up, everybody? Thanks for coming back to my channel. Steve Mortensen here, Coldwell Banker, North Orange County. Today I want to talk to you about some various terms that we throw about so easily in this business, and they're just simple terms out of the purchase contract or the offer that a buyer would make. We're going to go through those terms. We're going to talk about what each of them mean and what they mean to you. Stay tuned for more. All right, so the first term we're going to discuss today is price. Obviously, that one's pretty self-explanatory and probably the most important term on your contract. That is the price that you are going to make your initial offer at. Now, when you write that offer, the seller has a couple of options. One of them, they can accept your price as you've written. Two, they can just flat out reject your price. Or three, what's more likely and most common to happen is the seller is going to now send you a counter offer back. They're going to discuss price in their counter offer, most likely, but additionally, the seller also has the opportunity to change any terms in the contract. We'll get to some of those terms next. So one of the most common terms that a seller might want to adjust when a buyer presents an offer is going to be the close of escrow. So let's talk about what that means. When a seller and a buyer come to mutual terms on a contract, that constitutes what we call acceptance. Once the acceptance starts, that is day zero of a predetermined close of escrow period. Now, most typically here in California, we do a 30-day close of escrow. However, that date can be completely negotiated. Often 40 days or 45 days, sometimes even 60 days is common. All right, so the next term in the contract that you're going to hear realtors say is going to be the EMD, or the earnest money deposit. What that is once you get that acceptance again, where the buyer and the seller both agree on the other terms in the contract, the buyer is going to need to put forth a good faith show of money that they intend to buy this property. So sometimes you'll hear it as a good faith deposit. Technically, we call it the earnest money deposit. That is a determined amount, typically somewhere between 1% of the purchase price and 3% of the purchase price, that the buyer is going to take and they're going to transfer from their checking account into the escrow company's checking account. That way it's not in the seller's bank account, it's not in the buyer's bank account, it's not in the realtor's bank account, it's in a neutral third party's bank account. Now that again is another negotiable term, but typically between 1% and 3% of the purchase price. So the next term that is often up for negotiation is going to be revolving around physical inspections. Now, the way our contract is written here in California is that you as the buyer are agreeing to purchase this property in its as-is physical condition, the way it stands today. However, all of that is contingent upon you, if you choose, getting a professional physical home inspector out to the house. The contract defaults to giving you, the buyer, 17 days to do that. But in today's world where things are moving fast, no seller is likely to give you the full 17 days. In fact, in today's crazy hot market that we're in right now, it's pretty common that the seller will only give you, the buyer, 7 days to complete that physical home inspection. Now, once you complete that physical home inspection, you got a couple of options again. From there, maybe everything checks out. Maybe it's a super well-maintained home, right? If that's the case, you just move forward with the escrow. If you discover some things that you were unaware of, you as the buyer have the right to ask the seller to repair them, or ask the seller for a cash credit in lieu of making actual repairs. If you want to do it on your own, or you're going to do some renovations that you were already planning that will address that deficiency, you can do that. Typically, the seller is going to want to sell the home as is, because right now the seller has all the leverage. But you still get the right to inspect the home, and if you discover something major during that inspection period, you actually can cancel your escrow, get your earnest money deposit back, and move on to the next property. So the next contingency within this contract that we're going to discuss, or term, and I should back up and say, what is a contingency? A contingency is a fancy term that we use to say to the buyer, hey, you have the right to cancel the contract if something isn't met. So we call that a contingency. It's basically an escape clause for the buyer to be able to cancel this contract and move on to another property, right? So the loan contingency, that's another contingency in this contract that is commonly negotiated upon. Again, the contract gives you default 21 days, 3 weeks time. No seller is going to give you that much time in today's crazy market. So typically that number will be negotiated down somewhere around 15 days or 17 days. So what does that mean? That means from the mutual acceptance of the offer, you have 15 days or 17 days, whatever's mutually agreed upon between buyer and seller. You have that much time to submit all your paperwork to your bank, get your loan fully underwritten and approved by the bank. Typically that can be done in 15, 16, or 17 days. That's about the most you're gonna get in today's world. Now, super aggressive buyers will already have that process fully completed with their lender, where they don't actually even need a loan contingency, which effectively makes your offer just about as strong as cash. Nothing is as strong as all cash sitting in a bank account somewhere. But when your loan is already fully underwritten and you're approved and you don't need a loan contingency, you don't need that escape clause because you're 100% confident the bank will approve your loan, that puts you in a pretty strong position. All right, so the next contingency I want to discuss with you today is called the appraisal contingency. So what does that mean? That means most buyers are going to get a loan when they purchase a property, and you're typically going to borrow that money from a bank, right? So your bank wants an independent third party's opinion of the value. You and the seller have agreed upon a value, but they know that buyers and sellers are emotional when it comes to this process. So the bank is going to force you, as the buyer, to pay for an appraisal, right? And that appraisal is just one person's opinion of the value of that home on that day. Now, as we know, everyone's got slightly different opinions, so it doesn't mean that's the end-all be-all. That's not written in stone, but that is that bank's appraiser's opinion of the value of that property on that day. Typically, the contract defaults to 17 days that you get to conduct your appraisal. Now, most sellers, again, are going to want to shorten that time frame. You're probably only going to get 14 or 15 days to get that done. Totally doable. We do it all the time. Just know that the way the contract is written gives you 17 days. We're going to shorten that time. Now, what's most important to you and what we're seeing quite regularly right now is that whatever price you've agreed upon with the seller is here, but the bank's appraisers, they're not quite there yet. We're seeing lots of appraisals come in short or under the agreed upon purchase price. So let's talk about what happens when the bank's appraiser says the house isn't worth what you've agreed to pay the seller. You've got a handful of options here. One of them is you can simply cancel the contract, right? Say, hey, it's too far off. I'm not interested in purchasing. I got emotional. Another is you can ask the seller to lower the sales price down to whatever that bank appraiser thinks the home is worth. Although I will tell you, in this market, that's not super likely. What's most likely to happen is either A, the buyer's going to come up and bridge the gap, as we call it, where you pay the difference between your purchase price and your appraised value. We call that bridging the gap. Or B, you negotiate to meet somewhere in the middle, where the seller comes down slightly and you bridge part of the gap. So to illustrate that in numbers, let's say you offer $1.1 million for a house, and the bank's appraiser says the house is only worth $1 million. There's a $100,000 gap right there. Effectively, again, you can ask the seller to bring it down to the 1 million, which isn't super likely in today's world. You can pay the full difference, which commonly happens in today's world, or you can negotiate somewhere in between that 1 million and the 1.1, and maybe you put an extra 50,000 into the deal, but you still get the property, you get to move on. And remember, the appraisal is just one person's opinion of the value on that day. You could hire 5 appraisers and probably have 5 totally different numbers. Now, they're not going to be grossly apart, but 3% could be a total possibility. That's $30,000 on $1 million purchase. So there could be a pretty big swing there. So keep that in mind. All right, so there's one other clause in this contract that we don't see a lot in today's market because things are so hot right now, but that is a contingency for the sale of a buyer's current home. Now, this is a very challenging offer for us realtors to work with and for a buyer's agent to sell to a selling agent. And that is, there's so many variables, but effectively what it means is you as the buyer, you're writing an offer saying, hey, Mr. Seller, I'm willing to buy your house up here, but that whole deal is contingent upon me being able to sell my current home over here. It can happen. Every once in a while it does happen. It's just not super common in today's world, but potentially it is something you could make work out. And there's a few strategies we can use to put that deal together, but that's going to require a much more in-depth video, and we'll talk about that on another one. All right, so that wraps up kind of a brief walkthrough on some of the terminology that we find in our California residential purchase agreement, or the offer as we commonly call them. So I hope that this video sheds a little bit more light on some of these terms. I know they can be confusing, but if you've got other questions, feel free to like and comment below. I'll be happy to answer them or reach out directly. We'll talk to you soon.